My wife demanded a divorce because she thought I was broke. Then she accidentally found the accounts I spent 10 years hiding. I always wondered whether my wife loved me, or the life she hoped I'd eventually give her. Turns out, I got my answer the afternoon she slid divorce papers across our kitchen table. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I'm tired of wasting my best years on a man with no ambition." She had no idea she was saying that to a man worth nearly $18 million. The funniest part, the divorce papers were already the best financial decision I'd ever made, because the second she discovered the truth, she wanted to stay married. But that's getting ahead of myself. If you've ever wondered how someone can spend 10 years married to a person without really knowing them, let me assure you, it happens one tiny disappointment at a time. There isn't always a dramatic betrayal or a shocking affair. Sometimes love just gets buried under expectations until one day the person sleeping next to you starts looking at you like you're the biggest mistake they've ever made. My name is Liam Carter. I'm 36 years old, and until a few months ago, I believed I had mastered the art of living invisibly. I lived in Seattle, drove a 10-year-old blue Subaru Outback with more than 200,000 miles on it, wore the same collection of plain gray t-shirts I'd owned for years, and worked from the small home office in the back of our modest 3-bedroom house. If you passed me at the grocery store, you wouldn't remember my face 5 minutes later. That was intentional. I liked ordinary. Ordinary meant nobody asked questions. Ordinary meant nobody cared where my money came from, where it went, or why I never seemed interested in buying things everyone else chased. My wife Emily hadn't always hated ordinary. When we met, she used to tell me she loved how calm I was. She'd laugh whenever I turned down expensive restaurants in favor of tiny family-owned diners because, according to her, I always found the places with the best food. We'd spend Saturday mornings drinking cheap coffee while walking through Pike Place Market, pretending we were tourists in our own city. Back then, she used to say experiences mattered more than possessions. Funny how life tests statements like that. Because once everyone around us started getting promotions, buying bigger houses, posting tropical vacations online, and measuring happiness in square footage, experiences quietly stopped being enough. At first, I barely noticed the change. It came disguised as harmless comments. "Did you see Nicole's new kitchen?" she'd ask while scrolling Instagram. "It's gorgeous." I'd nod without looking away from my laptop. "Looks nice." Then came another. "Jason just bought a Tesla. Apparently his bonus this year was insane." I'd smile. Good for Jason. Another week passed. "Mark finally made partner at his law firm." "That's impressive." Another month. "Rachel and Ben are spending Christmas in Switzerland. Hope they have fun?" My answers never changed because I genuinely meant them. Other people's success never bothered me. I wasn't competing with them. Emily, however, slowly started acting like every announcement from our friends was somehow an accusation against me. At first, she only compared our lives privately. Then she began doing it in front of other people. We'd be at dinner with friends, and someone would mention remodeling their home. Emily would laugh and say, "Maybe one day Liam will finally take a risk and we'll have something worth remodeling." Everyone would chuckle awkwardly while I smiled into my drink. Someone would ask what I did for work. Before I could answer, she'd say, "He's basically an independent IT consultant. Stable, but not exactly exciting." Stable. That word always made me smile inside. Stable was one way to describe someone whose investments quietly earned more before lunch than most people made in 6 months. But she didn't know that. Nobody did. 10 years earlier, long before Emily and I got married, I'd sold the cybersecurity company I'd started in my 20s. The acquisition changed my life overnight, but it also taught me an ugly lesson about money. The week the deal became public, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted to reconnect. Old classmates messaged me asking for business opportunities. Investors pitched impossible ideas. Strangers somehow found my personal email. I watched people stop seeing me as Liam and start seeing me as a walking bank account. So I disappeared. The money moved into carefully structured trusts, holding companies, long-term investments, and assets managed by professionals I'd worked with for years. Publicly, I simply became an independent cybersecurity consultant. The income Emily saw entering our joint account each month looked comfortable but ordinary. Enough for mortgage payments, groceries, occasional dinners, and modest vacations. Everything else stayed where it belonged, far away from attention. Some people reading this are probably wondering why I hid it from my own wife. The answer isn't as dramatic as you might think. When we met, I had already decided I never wanted money to become the foundation of another relationship. I wanted someone who loved waking up beside me, not someone calculating what my net worth could buy. At first, keeping things simple felt natural. Then, years passed, and revealing the truth somehow became harder than maintaining the lie. Every anniversary, I thought, maybe this year. Every birthday I considered telling her everything. Then another year would pass, and I convinced myself it didn't matter because we were happy, until we weren't. Emily's obsession with appearances grew so gradually that I couldn't point to a specific moment everything changed. Social media didn't help. Every evening, she'd sit curled on the couch, endlessly scrolling through polished snapshots of other people's lives. Luxury handbags, oceanfront resorts, new kitchens, champagne on yachts, smiling couples standing beside luxury SUVs with giant red bows. She wasn't looking at pictures anymore. She was collecting evidence that everyone else had figured life out except us. One Friday evening, she tossed her phone onto the couch and sighed dramatically. Nicole's husband surprised her with a week in Paris. "That's nice," I said. "That's all you have to say?" she asked. "What else should I say?" "Maybe ask yourself why every husband except you seems capable of doing something romantic." I looked up from my laptop. "Emily, if you want to go to Paris, we can go." She rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might actually get stuck. "Not if we're staying in cheap hotels and counting every dollar." I almost laughed. She had no idea I already owned an apartment overlooking the Seine through an investment company she'd never heard of. Instead, I simply said, "A trip isn't defined by the hotel." That's exactly something a man with no money would say. She walked upstairs before I could answer. I stared at my reflection in the black laptop screen. That one stung. Not because she thought I was broke, because she'd started believing financial status determined whether a person's opinions had value. Months passed, the comments became sharper. "You're too comfortable being average. You never take risks. You're financially pathetic. Do you know how embarrassing it is telling people what you do?" Every insult arrived wrapped inside concern. "I'm only pushing you because I believe in your potential. I'm trying to motivate you. I don't want you settling." Funny thing about people trying to motivate you, they rarely notice when encouragement turns into humiliation. One Saturday afternoon, we attended Jason's housewarming party. His new place was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Washington. Marble countertops, smart everything. Guests wandered around complimenting the architecture while waiters carried trays of champagne. Emily practically glowed the entire evening. On the drive home, she stared silently out the passenger window. I figured she was tired. Then she spoke. "Do you know what it feels like?" "What?" "Being the least successful couple in every room we walk into." I kept my eyes on the road. "Success isn't measured by square footage?" She laughed, not the warm laugh I remembered from years ago. This one sounded tired, bitter. "People who don't have money always say things like that." "Emily, no, tell me I'm wrong." I didn't answer. "Exactly." We drove the rest of the way home in silence. A week later, she suggested we postpone trying for children. That conversation hurt more than all the others combined. We talked about becoming parents for years. We even had names picked out. Then one evening, while folding laundry, she quietly said, "I don't think this is the right time anymore." "Why?" I asked. She didn't even hesitate. "I refuse to raise kids in this house." I looked around our living room. Clean, safe, warm, bookshelves full of novels, family photos, a small fireplace she'd once decorated every Christmas with ridiculous enthusiasm. "What's wrong with this house?" "It's small." 3 bedrooms isn't small. Compared to everyone else it is. Compared to who? Everyone we know. I took a slow breath. Children don't care about granite countertops. Maybe not, but I do. Those 5 words echoed in my head for weeks. Maybe I do. She wasn't talking about children anymore. She was talking about status. Around that time, she stopped wearing her wedding ring consistently. At first, she'd say she forgot it after showering. Then she'd leave it on the bathroom counter for days. Eventually, she stopped pretending there was a reason. One night, I picked it up and placed it beside her while she watched television. She glanced down. "You forgot this." "No." She looked back at the screen. "I just didn't feel like wearing it today." I nodded and quietly walked away. I never mentioned it again. The guest bedroom slowly became hers. It started after an argument about money that wasn't really about money. She claimed my late-night work calls kept waking her up. The truth was, I'd had exactly 1 late-night call that month. Still, she moved her pillows into the other room. "It's temporary," she said. It wasn't. Temporary has a funny way of becoming permanent when neither person fights to change it. She canceled our anniversary dinner because one of her coworkers invited her to a networking event at an upscale rooftop bar. "It'll be better for my career," she explained. "We can celebrate another night." We never did. I bought flowers anyway. They sat on the kitchen counter until the petals turned brown. One evening, she came home carrying 3 designer shopping bags. I recognized the logo immediately. The purse she'd bought cost more than every piece of furniture in my office combined. "I thought we were trying to save," I said gently. She shrugged. "It was on sale." "Emily." At least one of us should look successful. She disappeared upstairs before I could respond, leaving the shopping bags beside the staircase like trophies. I stood there longer than I should have, wondering when conversations between us had become competitions with invisible judges. The cruelest moment came on an ordinary Tuesday. We were leaving the grocery store when she stopped beside my old Subaru. A brand new Mercedes SUV pulled into the space next to us. A couple about our age stepped out wearing expensive athletic clothes, laughing about something neither of us could hear. Emily watched them walk away before looking at my car. Then she actually sighed. "What?" I asked. She shook her head. "Nothing. Tell me." She hesitated just long enough to pretend she didn't want to hurt my feelings. "I honestly feel embarrassed getting into this thing." She said it quietly, almost kindly, which somehow made it worse. I looked at the faded blue paint, the tiny scratch on the rear bumper, the coffee stain on the passenger side floor mat she'd spilled years ago. I smiled. Not because it was funny, because at that exact moment, sitting inside a climate-controlled vault managed by one of my private asset firms was a watch collection worth several times more than every luxury vehicle in that parking lot combined. Yet somehow, this old Subaru had become proof, in her mind, that I was failing at life. I opened the passenger door for her anyway. She climbed in without thanking me. I drove us home in silence. That night, after she'd gone upstairs, I sat alone in my office staring at rows of investment reports glowing across my monitors. Numbers most people would never believe. Businesses quietly growing, properties appreciating, dividends arriving like clockwork. Every financial goal I'd ever set had been exceeded years ago. And yet, the one thing I couldn't seem to buy was the version of my wife who used to hold my hand while drinking $5 coffee and talking about dreams that had nothing to do with money. That's when I realized something painful. Emily didn't miss luxury. She missed the version of herself she imagined she'd become by marrying me. Somewhere along the way, she decided I was standing between her and the life she deserved. The saddest part? She never once asked whether I was actually happy. Weeks later, Seattle disappeared beneath one of those endless gray rainstorms that make the entire city feel quieter than usual. I finished work early and started cooking dinner. Chicken parmesan, one of Emily's favorites, or at least it used to be. Around 6:30, I heard the front door open. She walked in wearing a beige trench coat, her expression unreadable. No greeting, no kiss. She set a leather folder on the kitchen table and slowly removed her coat. I remember noticing how carefully she folded it over the chair, like she didn't want wrinkles. Funny what the brain focuses on before life changes forever. "Can we talk?" she asked. I nodded. She sat across from me. The rain tapped softly against the windows. The smell of garlic filled the kitchen. She slid the folder toward me. I already knew what it was before opening it. Divorce papers. I looked at the first page, then back at her. She folded her hands together. Calm, prepared, almost rehearsed. "I'm tired, Liam." "Of what?" "Waiting." For you to become the man I thought you would be," I say quiet. "I've spent my best years believing you'd eventually want more." She swallowed. "You never did." I studied her face, searching for even a trace of the woman I'd fallen in love with. I couldn't find her. "I deserve more than this," she continued. "I can't spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been if I'd married someone with ambition." I glanced around our kitchen. Family photos still hung on the walls. Our wedding picture sat beside the coffee machine. We looked impossibly young in that frame. Hopeful. "You never gave me the life you promised," she said softly. I frowned. "I don't remember promising you a mansion." "You promised we'd build something together." "I thought we did." She shook her head. "No, we survived together. That's different." I rested one hand on the papers. Then I asked the only question that really mattered. "So this is about money?" She looked away for a second. When she answered, her voice was almost gentle. "No." She met my eyes again. "It's about what money says about a man." Something inside me became perfectly still. Years of wondering, years of hoping, years of giving her the benefit of the doubt, gone in a single sentence. She believed a bank account measured character. That was all I needed to know. I picked up the pen she'd placed beside the papers. She blinked. "You're reading them?" "No." I signed the last page without hesitation. Her eyes widened. She'd expected questions. Anger, bargaining, maybe tears. Instead, I simply slid the folder back across the table. "Okay," I said quietly. For the first time all evening, Emily looked genuinely afraid. The kitchen stayed silent long after Emily picked up the signed divorce papers. Neither of us spoke. The chicken parmesan I'd spent an hour making sat untouched on the stove, slowly going cold while the rain continued tapping against the windows as if nothing significant had happened. It's funny what your brain remembers during moments like that. I don't remember what shirt I was wearing. but I remember the tiny crack in one of our kitchen tiles. I remember the faint smell of basil in the sauce. I remember watching steam disappear from 2 untouched plates and realizing that was probably the perfect metaphor for our marriage. Emily looked at me several times like she was waiting for something. Anger, desperation, maybe even regret. Instead, I simply stacked the plates, wrapped the food in aluminum foil, and put it in the refrigerator. She finally broke the silence. "That's it?" I looked over my shoulder. "What do you mean? You're not going to fight for us?" There was something almost insulting about the question. She had just explained that she believed my lack of financial success made me less of a man, handed me legal documents ending a decade of marriage, and somehow expected me to convince her to stay. "You already made your decision," I answered calmly. "I respect it." Her eyebrows pulled together slightly. "You don't seem upset." I smiled, though it wasn't out of happiness. It was the smile someone gives after finally solving a puzzle that's been bothering them for years. "I'm disappointed," I admitted. "There's a difference." She stared at me for another few seconds before quietly taking the folder and walking upstairs. I heard the guest bedroom door close. That was the first night after our marriage officially ended, even though the paperwork hadn't been filed yet. The strange part wasn't the sadness, it was the peace. For months, I'd been trying to understand why every conversation with Emily felt like an interview I was destined to fail. Suddenly, I didn't have to wonder anymore. She'd answered every question herself. The following morning felt bizarrely normal. I woke up at 6, made coffee, watered the plants by the kitchen window, and answered emails from my consulting business. Emily came downstairs around 8 dressed for work. She looked exhausted. There were faint circles under her eyes, and for a split second she looked like the woman I'd married instead of the stranger she'd become. She opened the refrigerator, grabbed yogurt, then hesitated. "Morning?" she said quietly. "Morning." She kept glancing toward me while pretending to scroll through her phone. Finally, she asked, "So, what happens now?" "Our attorney files the paperwork. We separate finances. You find a place if that's still your plan." She nodded slowly. "Yeah." Another silence settled over the kitchen. "I'll probably start looking at apartments after work," she finally added. "Okay." She waited again. Apparently, she still expected resistance. When none came, she picked up her purse and left without another word. The front door closed behind her. I looked at the empty chair where she'd been sitting and realized I'd spent years trying to save a marriage that only one of us wanted to save. That realization hurt less than I expected. Maybe because I'd been grieving long before the divorce papers arrived. Over the next several days, we became polite roommates. We exchanged schedules, discussed utility bills, and occasionally asked whether the other wanted groceries while we were out. It felt less like a marriage ending and more like coworkers finishing the last week before transferring to different departments. Emily spent every evening searching apartment listings on her laptop. She'd sigh dramatically whenever she found somewhere she liked before noticing the monthly rent. Seattle wasn't cheap. More than once I heard her mutter, "How does anyone afford this?" I almost answered every time. Instead, I stayed quiet. Meanwhile, I started preparing for something she'd never notice. My office had always been off limits, not because I was hiding anything, but because that room genuinely was my workplace. Emily rarely entered unless she needed a charger or wanted to ask whether I wanted takeout. Behind the ordinary desk, inexpensive bookshelves, and 2 computer monitors was an entirely different life. Most of my sensitive financial information wasn't stored physically. It existed inside encrypted drives protected by hardware, authentication keys, and security systems I designed myself years ago. Still, there were a handful of original trust agreements, corporate formation documents, and investment summaries stored inside a locked fireproof cabinet. They'd been sitting there untouched for years, not because I was careless, but because I trusted my wife. Funny how quickly trust changes after someone hands you divorce papers. 2 days after signing, I called my attorney, Daniel. We'd known each other for over 15 years. He'd helped structure nearly every major business decision I'd ever made. "I figured this call was coming," he said after answering. "She finally filed?" "Not yet. Soon. How are you holding up?" I looked out my office window at the rain-soaked maple tree in our backyard. "Better than I expected." That's usually how people sound after they've accepted something instead of losing it. He was right. "I want to move the originals." "Already arranged," he replied. "Courier tomorrow morning." "Good." There was a brief pause before he asked the question I knew was coming. "Does she know?" I laughed quietly. "Daniel, she thinks I'm a freelance IT consultant making 85 grand a year." Even through the phone, I could hear him exhale. "Then let's keep it that way. That's the plan." The courier arrived the next morning in an unmarked SUV. He wore plain clothes, carried an ordinary black briefcase, and looked more like an accountant than someone transporting documents worth millions. Emily had already left for work. which made things easier. Within 15 minutes, every original trust agreement, stock certificate, corporate resolution, and estate document had been packed into secure transport cases. I signed a receipt, shook the courier's hand, and watched him disappear down the street. That should have been the end of it. But life has a strange habit of making the smallest mistakes at exactly the worst possible moments. I still had digital backups on an encrypted external solid-state drive. Normally, that wasn't an issue because the drive never left my desk and required multiple authentication layers to access. I planned to transfer the remaining encrypted archives to an offline vault the following weekend. I figured 5 more days wouldn't matter. I was wrong. 3 afternoons later, Seattle was hit by an unexpected storm. Around 1 o'clock, the lights flickered once. Then everything went black. My monitor shut off instantly. The air conditioner died. Somewhere downstairs, I heard the microwave beep before silence swallowed the entire house. Seriously? I muttered. I reached for the external drive connected to my workstation. During sudden power failures, the encrypted hardware occasionally refused to disconnect properly until the operating system completed its shutdown sequence. Without electricity, it simply locked itself in place. Normally, I'd wait. Except that afternoon, I had a scheduled video call with one of my investment managers, and I needed the drive disconnected before switching to my backup laptop. I tried ejecting it manually. Nothing. I sighed. Fine. 5 minutes. At that exact moment, I heard the front door open downstairs. Liam? Emily called. Power's out everywhere. My office sent everyone home. I'm upstairs. She climbed the stairs while I continued working with the drive. Internet's down too, she said, stopping in the doorway. Looks like the whole neighborhood lost electricity. Probably the storm. She leaned against the doorframe. What are you doing? Trying to disconnect a stubborn drive. Need help? No, I've got it. She stepped into the room anyway. Normally, I would have closed the encrypted folders before anyone entered, but without power, my monitors were frozen exactly where they'd been moments earlier. Several document previews remained visible across one screen. Company names, legal agreements, investment summaries. Nothing obvious unless you knew what you were looking at. Emily glanced casually toward the monitors. Looks complicated. Occupational hazard. She wandered behind my chair while looking around the office. You've always had so much paperwork for consulting. Comes with the job. Her eyes landed on one document titled Carter Strategic Holdings LLC. Who's that client? She asked. Old project. Sounds fancy. Lawyers like fancy names? She laughed softly. True. Then she noticed another file. Hawthorne International Trust. Another client. Something like that. If she'd left right then, none of what happened afterward would have happened. Instead, the electricity suddenly surged back. Every monitor flashed to life simultaneously. Windows reopened exactly where I'd left them. Password managers unlocked because the authentication token was still connected. The encrypted dashboard automatically refreshed before I had time to close anything. I felt my stomach tighten. Emily wasn't paying attention at first. Then her eyes drifted toward the center monitor. Wow, she whispered. I turned instinctively, but I already knew what she'd seen. An account summary had loaded automatically. The largest balance appeared near the top. $7,846,319.42. She frowned. That's quite a client. I forced myself to stay calm. Investment management. For who? I didn't answer immediately. Another window refreshed. A different portfolio appeared. $3,115,884.09. Emily stepped closer. Hold on. She looked back and forth between both screens. These are all yours? My silence answered for me. She laughed nervously. No, seriously. Then another report finished loading. Commercial property holdings. $5,928,447.77. Her breathing changed. Liam, I slowly minimized one window, but it was already too late. Her eyes weren't moving like someone reading random numbers anymore. They were connecting dots. The account owner listed across each report wasn't a client. It was me, Liam Carter, beneficiary, managing member, trustee, director. She stared without blinking. Her voice barely worked. These belong to you? I looked at her for several long seconds before quietly saying, you should probably leave my office. She didn't move. Answer me. Emily. No. Her eyes never left the monitor. Answer me. I leaned back in my chair. There wasn't much point pretending anymore. She'd already seen enough. Yes. Just one word. Yes. It was like watching someone's entire understanding of reality collapse in real time. She looked at me, then the screen, then back again. 7 million? Silence. 3 million? Silence. 5. She stopped speaking altogether. Finally, she whispered, "How much money do you have?" I smiled sadly. Apparently not enough to make me ambitious. She flinched like I'd slapped her. Neither of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. Then, without another word, she slowly backed toward the hallway. "Emily," she paused. "Don't touch anything in here again." She nodded automatically before leaving the room. I listened to her footsteps disappear downstairs. A minute later, I heard the front door close. Most people assume the dramatic moment in stories like this is when the secret comes out. It wasn't. The dramatic part happened afterward, because curiosity is louder than guilt. That evening, Emily barely spoke during dinner. She kept staring at me whenever she thought I wasn't looking. Around midnight, after I heard her bedroom door close, security notifications quietly appeared on my phone. Motion detected. Office. I opened the camera feed. Emily stood inside my office wearing socks so her footsteps wouldn't make noise. She wasn't stealing anything. She was taking pictures. Every document she could find, every company name, every trust agreement still sitting on my desk, every screen I'd forgotten to lock after dinner. She photographed them all with shaking hands before quietly leaving 5 minutes later. I didn't stop her. I simply watched. The following day, she called in sick to work. I knew because I overheard the conversation through the kitchen while making coffee. Then she spent the entire day researching. I could hear keyboard clicks from the dining room for hours. Occasionally, she'd gasp softly. Once I heard her whisper, "No way." That evening, she looked at me differently. Not lovingly, not angrily, almost cautiously, like she discovered she'd been living beside someone she never actually knew. Later that night, after she'd gone upstairs, I checked the search history she'd forgotten to close on the shared family iPad. Carter Strategic Holdings, Hawthorne International Trust, Pacific Shield Cybersecurity Acquisition. Then the final search stopped me cold. Liam Carter Cybersecurity Company Acquisition Seattle. She'd found it. An archived business article from more than a decade earlier. There I was in an old photograph wearing a suit I'd completely forgotten I owned, shaking hands with the CEO of the company that acquired my startup. The headline mentioned the sale without listing an exact number, but industry analysts quoted in follow-up articles estimated the acquisition at nearly $28 million. Emily clicked every single one. Then came interviews I'd given years ago before disappearing from public life. Articles about patents, technology conferences, magazine features calling me one of the country's most promising young cybersecurity entrepreneurs. She spent hours reading everything. Around 2 a.m, another security notification appeared. She entered my office again. This time, she didn't touch anything. She simply stood there, staring at the monitors with tears quietly rolling down her face. The woman who called me financially pathetic less than a week earlier finally understood something that shattered every assumption she'd built our marriage on. I wasn't unsuccessful. I wasn't unlucky. I wasn't lacking ambition. I'd simply never needed the world to know I'd already won. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen expecting awkwardness. Instead, something stranger happened. The leather folder containing our divorce papers was no longer sitting inside the kitchen drawer where she'd carefully placed it after I'd signed. I found Emily standing at the counter making coffee, acting as though nothing had changed. She smiled, a small, uncertain smile I hadn't seen in months, and asked, "Morning, did you sleep okay?" Then she quietly closed the drawer she'd just opened, as if she'd never removed the divorce papers from it in the first place. The next morning, I almost laughed when I walked into the kitchen. Almost. Emily was standing at the stove wearing one of my old college sweatshirts, humming softly while flipping pancakes. She hadn't made me breakfast on a weekday in years. Usually she'd already be halfway to work with an overpriced latte in one hand and her phone in the other. This morning, however, there was fresh coffee brewing, orange juice poured into a glass instead of the carton, and bacon sizzling in the pan. She turned around the moment she heard my footsteps. "Good morning," she said with a smile so warm it almost looked rehearsed. "I made breakfast." I leaned against the doorway and studied her face. 24 hours earlier, this same woman had been researching divorce attorneys and luxury apartments. Now she was acting like we were newlyweds again. "You didn't have to do that," I replied. "I wanted to." She carried a plate to the table before I could protest. Pancakes, eggs, bacon, fresh fruit. My favorite breakfast, prepared exactly the way I liked it. She even remembered I preferred my coffee black. For years, she teased me for drinking it without sugar. Today, she handed me the mug with both hands. "I figured you could use a good breakfast." I thanked her and sat down. Outwardly, I looked appreciative. Internally, I was watching a performance. The timing was too perfect. Not once in the months leading up to the divorce had she asked what I wanted for breakfast. Now, less than a day after discovering the financial documents in my office, she suddenly remembered every little detail that used to matter. She kept looking at me while I ate, waiting for a reaction bigger than a simple thanks. When she didn't get one, she smiled anyway. How is it? Really good. I'm glad. She hesitated before adding, I miss doing things like this. There it was. The first line of a script she hadn't even realized she was following. I nodded politely. It has been a while. Too long. She reached across the table and rested her hand lightly on mine. 6 months ago, she wouldn't even sit beside me during movie nights. Now she was touching me as though physical affection had never disappeared. I let her hand stay there for exactly 3 seconds before reaching for my coffee. Not rejecting her, not encouraging her, just moving naturally. I watched disappointment flicker across her face before she quickly hid it behind another smile. The changes didn't stop there. That evening, I came home from a grocery run to find candles lit across the dining room table. Emily had ordered takeout from the Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated our 3rd wedding anniversary. She'd even found the old jazz playlist we used to listen to while cooking together. I thought we could have a date night, she said casually. Just because. Just because. Not because she'd spent the previous afternoon discovering her husband wasn't an underpaid consultant. Not because she'd read article after article about a startup acquisition worth tens of millions. Just because. I almost admired the commitment to the act. Sounds nice? I answered. Her smile widened, though I noticed she relaxed only after I agreed to sit down. Throughout dinner, she laughed more than she had in months. She complimented my haircut, even though I hadn't gotten one. She told me my shirt looked nice, despite it being the same gray t-shirt I'd owned for years. She asked about my day with genuine curiosity that had mysteriously vanished long before the divorce papers appeared. Every compliment felt polished, carefully selected, like someone reading from a relationship advice article titled, How to Win Back Your Husband. The strangest part wasn't that she was trying. The strangest part was that if she'd done any of this 2 weeks earlier, it might actually have mattered. A few days later, she knocked softly on my office door before entering. Busy? Not particularly. Can I ask you something? I closed my laptop. Sure. She leaned against the doorframe with forced casualness. Do you own stocks? I looked at her for a second. Some? A lot? I shrugged. Enough. She laughed awkwardly. You always answer questions like you're being interviewed by the FBI. Occupational habit? Right. She looked around my office before asking another question. How much money do you think someone needs to retire comfortably? Depends on the person. Ballpark? Some people retire happily with $1 million. Others aren't satisfied with 50. She nodded slowly, storing every vague answer in her head. Makes sense? Then came the next one. Have you ever inherited anything? No. Which was true. Every dollar I'd made came from years of 80-hour work weeks, sleepless nights, and building a company that nearly failed twice before succeeding. Interesting, she murmured. Why? Just curious? The questions became more frequent after that. What happens if someone owns businesses overseas? Can trust protect assets? Is it common for entrepreneurs to keep money in holding companies? Do people really have accounts in different countries? I answered each question with just enough truth to satisfy her curiosity without revealing anything meaningful. Sometimes. Depends on the jurisdiction. Talk to an attorney? Every situation is different. Watching her frustration build was strangely fascinating. She desperately wanted certainty, but certainty was the one thing I refused to give her. One Friday afternoon, I received a call from Daniel. She's hired people. I assumed she would. A forensic accountant. I figured. A private investigator. I smiled faintly. And a family law specialist who charges more per hour than most surgeons. Anything else? Daniel chuckled. You're taking this remarkably well. I've had years to prepare for problems I hoped I'd never have. I've already reviewed everything. They can investigate all they want. They aren't getting through those structures. I know. They're going to spend a fortune proving you have money. And another fortune discovering they can't touch it. Daniel laughed. Exactly. After hanging up, I sat quietly for a moment. None of this surprised me. What surprised me was how quickly Emily had shifted from wanting freedom to wanting information. She wasn't trying to understand me. She was trying to understand my balance sheet. That weekend, she suggested we go hiking, something she hadn't wanted to do in years because, in her words, there's no point walking around in the woods when we could be at a resort. Suddenly, the mountains sounded romantic again. I agreed, not because I wanted to repair the marriage, because sometimes the easiest way to understand someone's intentions is to give them enough room to reveal them themselves. The first time Emily told me she loved me after discovering the truth, I almost believed the version of her that existed 10 years ago was trying to fight her way back to the surface. We were standing in the kitchen where she'd handed me divorce papers only weeks earlier. Morning sunlight poured through the windows, and she was holding 2 mugs of coffee exactly the way she used to when we were first married. She smiled nervously and said, "I forgot how good we were together." If someone had walked into the house at that exact moment without knowing everything that had happened, they probably would have thought we were rebuilding our marriage. They would have seen a husband quietly drinking coffee and a wife trying to reconnect after a rough patch. What they wouldn't have seen was a notification that had appeared on my phone an hour earlier informing me that Emily had another meeting scheduled with the forensic accountant she'd hired after secretly photographing my financial records. They wouldn't have known that Daniel had investigators documenting every attempt her legal team made to trace assets that had never belonged to our marriage in the first place. And they definitely wouldn't have known that every encrypted folder in my office recorded access logs down to the exact second someone opened, copied, printed, or photographed a document. The moment Emily walked into my office that night after I discovered the motion alert, the system had already begun creating a timeline. Every folder she opened, every file she viewed, every screenshot she took, every removable device connected to my workstation. Years earlier, I'd built those safeguards because of corporate espionage. I never imagined they'd end up documenting my own wife. "You're smiling," Emily said softly, interrupting my thoughts. "Was I? A little?" I looked into my coffee. "Just thinking. About us? Something like that." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I've been thinking too." I waited. "I made a mistake." There it was. Not, "I hurt you." Not, "I judged you." Just, "I made a mistake." There was a subtle but important difference. One admitted pain, the other admitted poor strategy. "People make mistakes," I answered. "Can we fix this one?" I looked at her for several seconds before asking, "Do you remember what you told me the day you handed me those papers?" She nodded slowly. "I said a lot of things I regret. You told me money says something about a man." Her face fell. I was angry. "No," I said quietly. "You were honest." She opened her mouth to argue before closing it again. She knew I was right. Angry people don't invent beliefs, they reveal them. She changed the subject instead. "Maybe we don't have to keep moving toward the divorce." I simply shrugged. "We'll see." That answer gave her hope. It was exactly what I wanted. Not because I planned to reconcile, because hope has a funny way of making people reveal themselves. Over the following 2 weeks, Emily became the version of herself she'd probably always believed she could be. She laughed more, cooked dinners, suggested weekend trips, left little handwritten notes beside a coffee mug that said things like, "Thinking of you" and "Love you." She even started wearing her wedding ring again. If I met her for the first time during those weeks, I would have assumed she adored her husband. Meanwhile, Daniel kept forwarding me updates. The private investigator she'd hired had spent days trying to identify every company connected to my name. The forensic accountant had successfully confirmed that several holding companies ultimately benefited me, but couldn't establish marital ownership. Every report reached the same conclusion. The wealth existed. The legal path to it did not. One afternoon, Daniel invited me to his office. When I arrived, 3 thick folders already sat on the conference table. "You're going to appreciate this," he said with a grin. He opened the first folder, Private Investigator Report. Inside were timelines, surveillance notes, public records, and summaries of every inquiry Emily's legal team had made. He slid another folder toward me. Forensic accounting conclusions. I skimmed the executive summary. Asset ownership predates marriage. Corporate structures legally maintained. Trust protections valid. No evidence of commingling sufficient to convert separate property into marital property. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Now, for my favorite part." He opened the third folder. Printed screenshots, text messages, emails, social media conversations voluntarily provided by mutual acquaintances after subpoenas and discovery requests began. Emily had been remarkably careless with her phone. One message to her best friend read, "If I can stop the divorce before it's finalized, everything changes." Another said, "You don't walk away from that kind of money." Then another, "Maybe he hid it because he wanted to test me. If I prove I'm committed now, he'll probably forgive me." I stared at the pages for a long time, not because they surprised me, because seeing betrayal in writing somehow hurts differently than hearing it spoken. Daniel quietly slid one final transcript toward me. "Legally obtained," he assured me. Washington is a 2-party consent state for many recordings, so we relied only on evidence gathered lawfully through authorized investigative methods and discovery. The transcript summarized statements Emily had made during consultations that became discoverable in the litigation process. The recurring theme was impossible to ignore. She wanted the marriage back only after learning the truth about my finances. I closed the folder. "That's enough." Daniel nodded. "You ready?" "I have been since she handed me the papers." The final settlement conference arrived on a gray Seattle morning that matched my mood perfectly. Emily walked into the law office wearing the same navy dress she'd worn on our anniversary 3 years earlier. For a brief moment, I remembered how beautiful she'd looked dancing with me that night. Then I remembered she'd canceled the last 2 anniversaries because she was embarrassed by the man standing beside her. Memories have a way of correcting themselves. She smiled when she saw me. Morning. Morning. I was hoping, she began before stopping. Never mind. Her attorney looked optimistic. Mine looked relaxed. There is a significant difference between those two expressions. Optimism depends on hope. Relaxation depends on preparation. We sat across from one another while the attorneys exchanged documents. Emily kept glancing toward me with the hopeful smile she'd perfected over recent weeks. I wondered whether she actually believed she'd convinced me. Eventually, her attorney cleared his throat. Given recent developments, my client believes reconciliation remains possible. Daniel looked at me. I nodded once. He opened a folder. Then perhaps reconciliation should begin with honesty. He slid several documents across the table. Emily frowned as she looked down. The first page contained timestamps from my office security system showing unauthorized after-hours access to encrypted financial records. The second documented photographs taken of confidential files. The third summarized the forensic investigation initiated after those events. Her smile disappeared. Daniel calmly continued. We also have evidence showing that immediately after discovering these assets, Mrs. Carter suspended her apartment search, consulted multiple financial professionals regarding my client's wealth, and discussed remaining in the marriage specifically because of that wealth. Emily looked at her attorney. What is this? Her attorney flipped through the pages. His expression changed with every document. Then came the printed text messages, then the discovery summaries, then the investigative reports. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody accused anyone dramatically. The evidence spoke for itself. Emily finally looked at me. You were watching me? No, I answered calmly. My security systems were. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Liam, please. You stopped loving me when you thought I was ordinary. She shook her head violently. That's not true. I looked at the papers between us, then explained these messages. She couldn't. Explain why every attempt to save this marriage happened after you saw the account balances. Silence. Explain why you called me financially pathetic before discovering I was wealthy. More silence. Finally, she whispered, I was wrong. Yes, people deserve second chances. I nodded slowly. Sometimes. Hope returned to her face for half a second before I finished the sentence. Trust doesn't. The room became painfully quiet. Daniel placed the final settlement agreement on the table. Every major asset I'd accumulated before the marriage remained separate property under long-established legal structures. Emily received exactly what the law entitled her to receive from the marital estate, her share of jointly owned assets accumulated during the marriage. Nothing more. No ownership interests in companies she'd never helped build. No claim to trusts established years before we met. No investment portfolio. No offshore holdings. No commercial properties. Her attorney reviewed everything twice before quietly removing his glasses. The documents appear legally sound, he admitted. Emily looked at him in disbelief. There has to be something. He slowly shook his head. There isn't. She turned back toward me. You planned all this. I met her eyes. No, I planned my financial future. You planned the divorce. For the first time since I'd known her, Emily had absolutely nothing to say. The divorce became final several weeks later. There was no dramatic courtroom confrontation. No last-minute confession. Just signatures, court filings, and the quiet ending of a marriage that had actually ended long before the paperwork caught up. I sold the house a few months afterwards, not because it held painful memories, but because it belonged to a version of my life that no longer existed. I bought a modest waterfront home in the Pacific Northwest, where the mornings were quiet enough to hear waves against the shore while drinking coffee on the porch. The house wasn't enormous. It didn't need to be. I still drove an older car. I still wore plain clothes. Most of my neighbors probably assumed I worked remotely for some technology company. That suited me perfectly. Eventually, I began anonymously mentoring young entrepreneurs through nonprofit programs, helping founders avoid mistakes I'd made and encouraging them to build businesses without letting money become their identity. None of them knew who I really was at first. I preferred earning respect before revealing success. Sometimes I'd think about Emily, not with anger anymore, mostly with sadness. People often ask whether wealth ruined my marriage. The truth is much simpler. Money didn't destroy what we had. It exposed what had already been broken. If she'd never discovered the truth, she would have walked away convinced she'd escaped an unsuccessful man. Instead, she walked away knowing she'd abandoned someone she never truly bothered to understand. Looking back, The richest thing I ever owned wasn't the companies, the investments, the trust, or the accounts. It was the ability to leave with my self-respect intact. She thought being poor made me a failure. In the end, pretending to be ordinary was the most valuable investment I ever made. It didn't make me rich. It showed me who was counting my money instead of my blessings. The end.
Okay, so first of all, he worth 18 million and she called him financially pathetic. Excuse me, ma'am. And then the line just that says, "I'm just trying to motivate you," is just insult wearing a nice outfit. And when she found out about the fortune, the pancakes, wife of the year role and all, that's just pure shit. Like, okay, this story honestly is the calmest revenge I have ever heard. Not yelling, not chaos, just receipts and consequences. Like, her lawyer told him that there is nothing, there is not nothing, there isn't anything to fight for. Like, her own lawyer told her that there isn't anything to fight for. So, like, it's a crazy good story, like good revenge.